Yo, what's good? Welcome back to Groove Selective. Today we're going to be remaking the massive Yeah remix by Dimitri Vegas and Like Mike. Hard techno has been exploding recently, and it's been mad seeing some of these main stage legends come into the game with some of their biggest songs like Mammoth and Tremor. But today we're going to be breaking down how they made this hard techno banger, bringing back the iconic reverse bass sound. Let's jump into a preview of what you're going to be making today. Let's jump straight in. Now, the first thing you want to do when you're creating a hard techno banger like this, you're going to be setting the BPM to around 145 to 150. We're going to be starting off with this bass line. Now, you're going to be starting on the note of G, and that is going to last for 4 bars. Then moving on to the next MIDI pattern, you're going to be starting on G again, and then moving down to D sharp, and then moving up to C. The G is going to last for 2 bars, the D sharp is going to last for 1 bar, and the C is going to last for half a bar. But at the end of the drop, that C is going to be lasting for a full bar. Now, if we move on to the sound design for the bass, now we're going to start off with this reversal 2 sound. Now, this is a reverse bass sound. You can find this in the Groove Selective Warehouse Techno Volume 1 pack, and you're going to find over 250 unique 7.2 preset samples and loops in this pack. So if you want to make music a bit like Amy Lenz, Maddox, or Sarah Landry, this is going to be the pack for you. Let's dive into this sound. You're going to load up oscillator B and you're going to use a sine wave. You're then going to move to this warp function down here. So we go alt warp, bend plus minus, and you're going to move this function up to around minus 70%. Don't forget to turn your oscillator down by 2 octaves, and then we're going to go over to our filter 1 here. Filter 1 is affecting oscillator B in this instance. We've turned oscillator A off, and then we're moving on to LFO 1. LFO 1 is what is creating that reverse bass sound. You want to set the rate to quarter notes. You're going to create an envelope which looks a little bit like this, and then you're going to set this to retrigger and assign this to your level. And then you're also going to be assigning this to your effects, but that's going to be later on. And then we're going to move on to envelope 1. Envelope 1 is mostly kept at default. You can set your ADSR settings to the ones that I've set below. And next we're going to be moving on to our effects. Now this is the magic of the sound, and this is what makes this bass so hard hitting. So we're going to be using a filter. You're going to go to flanges, and then you're going to go down to phase 36 minus. Then you're going to turn your cutoff to around 75%. Your resonance is going to be around 30%, and your drive is going to be around 60%. And then you're going to turn your mix level all the way up. And then we're going to move on to our distortion. We're using the tube model, and you're going to turn your drive all the way up to around 80%. We're also attaching LFO 1 here to our drive, and that's just going to be maxing out every time that reverse bass comes in. And then make sure your mix level is at 100%. Then we're using a compressor. This is controlling the dynamics of the sound, and we're just bringing out some of that top end and some of that low end and leaving that mid-range at 0. And then we've got an EQ just to take out some of that harsh top end of the sound. And in context, it should sound a little bit like this. Next, we're going to move on to this bass stab sound. Again, you can find this in the packs down below, and this is going to be in the Warehouse Techno Volume 1 pack. And you're going to be using 3 oscillators for this sound. Now, don't worry if you only have access to 2 oscillators in Serum 1, you can copy this for the most part. We've just got 1 extra oscillator, and that's just to make the sound a little bit bigger. You're going to go to oscillator A, and you're going to select the Wavetable Basic MCB. Now, this is basically just a saw wave. And then you're going to turn this down by 3 octaves. You're going to turn your unison up to 7, your detune down to 0, and your blend up by 75. Then you're going to go down to your warp function, and you're going to go P, D to B, turn this up to around 60%. And then you move over to oscillator B. You're going to use a triangle wave. Now this can be found in basic shapes. And you're going to turn your wavetable position to position 3. And then we're going to move on to the final oscillator here, where we're just using a saw wave, so you can go default shapes, and then you're just going to keep it on position 1. And then we're going to move on to the noise. Now we're sending the noise direct out, so you can select this here. The noise we're using is the micro quark noise, and you can find this in analog. Micro quark noise here. And then you're going to move on to filter 1, and you're going to assign this to oscillator A and B, and you're going to turn the cutoff down to 20 Hertz. Now you might think, why have you done that? That's going to cut off all the sound. Don't fret, we're going to be using one of the envelopes to control this filter. So if we move over to envelope 1 here, which is controlling our cutoff filter, you can assign this just by moving this over, and then you're going to copy our ADSR settings just down below. And then moving on to envelope 2, we've assigned this to our noise level, and this is just so it happens at the start of the sound. to give it a little bit more punch. You can copy our ADSR settings here. You're going to assign envelope 2 to your level. And then we're moving on to envelope 3. Envelope 3, you can copy the ADSR settings now. However, this is being used to control one of our effects, which I'm going to show you later. So next, let's move on to our effects. We're using hyperdimension, and we're using both modules in this case. You're going to set your rate to 40%, and you're going to set your detune to 60%. And then your mix level is going to be set to 28%. Then you're going to move on to the dimension module, and you're going to turn the size all the way down. Your mix is going to be turned up to 22%. Then we're going to move on to the distortion module here. We're using the Seinfeld model, and you're going to turn your drive up to 23%. And your mix level is going to be turned up to 78%. And this is going to make the sound nice and gritty. Then we're going to move on to the multiband compressor. Again, we're just controlling dynamics here. However, we are bringing out some of that top end and the low end. We're also bringing out a little bit more of that mid-range. We've got one more filter here, and this filter is being controlled by envelope 3. So you can drag and drop envelope 3 onto the cutoff filter, and this is going to trigger every single time the sound plays. And next we've got a reverb, and we're using the Hall model. The size is set to around 35%, and decay time is around 4 to 5 seconds. And then your mix level is around 55%. And then we're using an EQ, and this is just taking out a touch of that low end. In context, it should sound a little bit like this. Now moving on to the lead, you're going to be starting on G, and then you're going to be moving to D, and then you're going to go back to the G and resolve on the D sharp. And then for your next 2 bars, it's just going to be playing in reverse. And then for the second half of the drop, we've got this small change. So we're going to be starting on G, moving up to D, and then going back to G, up to D sharp, which performs twice here, as you can see on the MIDI grid, and then back down to G, and then up to D sharp, and then down to G. And again, the same happens here, but it's just played in reverse. And it should sound a little bit like this. Next, we're going to move on to the first lead sound. Now, this lead sound is the lead aggressor, which you can find in the Warehouse Techno pack down below. You're going to set both oscillators to basic shapes. You're going to turn the fine pitch up by 10 on oscillator A, and the fine pitch down by 10 on oscillator B. Then you're going to turn the unison up by 8 on oscillator A, and duplicate the setting on oscillator B. Your detune is going to be set to around halfway, and your blend is just going to be set to just over halfway on oscillator A. Your detune on oscillator B is going to be set to around 40%, and your bend is going to be set to the same as oscillator A. Then moving on to your wavetable position, you're going to set this to position 2, and then you're going to come down to this warp function on both oscillators, and you're going to go alt warp and then bend minus, and that is going to reshape our wavetables like you can see here. So if I turn this all the way down, we can see this is just a generic saw wave. If I turn it up a little bit, we're just adding a little bit of bend to that wavetable, which changes the shape of the sound. Now we're moving on to our noise. So we're using the bright white noise. You can go to analog and select bright white, and you're going to set your level to around 30 to 40%. And then you're going to move on to filter 1, and you're just going to take out some of those lows. And this is going to be affecting oscillator A and oscillator B. And then you're going to move on to envelope 1 and copy our ADSR settings just down below. Now moving on to our effects for the sound, we're using distortion, we're using the tube model, and you're going to set your drive to around about 40%. And then your mix level is going to be at 100%. Then we're using a ping pong delay. This is going to create a little bit more stereo width between the left and the right, and then you're going to be using a ping pong delay. Your left side is going to be set to 8th note, your right side is going to be set to quarter note. Your feedback should be around 35%, and your mix should also be around the same. And then we're going to move on to our compressor. Again, we're controlling dynamics here. We're just bringing out some of those lows and some of that top end, making the sound nice and fat. And then we're moving on to our reverb. We're using the plate model. Set your size to around 35%, add around 5 milliseconds of pre-delay, and then turn your width up to 100%. And this is going to make it sound nice and wide. And then you're going to turn your mix level up to around 35%. And then we're using a filter just to cut off that low end energy. We are adding a little bit more drive, and we're using the fat knob here to make it sound a little bit bigger. And then again, we've got another EQ with just taking off that low end and boosting some of that top end. And next we're moving on to the industrial lead. Again, you can find this in the Warehouse Techno Volume 1 pack. So for this sound, you can copy oscillator A over to oscillator B. It's pretty much the exact same. You're going to start off by going to basic shapes, and you're going to go analog, basic shapes, and you're going to set your wavetable position to position 2. Then you're going to turn your unison up to +16, and then you're going to set your detune to around about halfway, and your blend to 75. And then we're going to move on to LFO1. LFO1 is controlling the detune for both of these oscillators. So you can copy our envelope here. You're going to select the envelope function and you're going to make sure this is set to quarter note. Then we're going to move on to envelope 1 and you just need to copy our ADSR settings down below. We're going to move on to our effects and you're going to be using the hyperdimension module. Now in this instance, you're not going to be using the hyper module, but you are going to be using dimension, this just to make it sound a little bit bigger and wider. Now you're going to set your size to around 50% and your mix level is going to be set to around 20 to 25%. Then you're going to use a phaser. You're going to turn the mix all the way up. You're going to set your rate to 0.08 Hertz, and your first depth knob is going to be at 0, your second depth knob is going to be at 50%, and then your frequency at 0, feedback 0, and your phase halfway. And then we're going to be using a reverb, and we're using the Hall model, and then you're going to set your size to around 35%, your decay time to 4 to 5 milliseconds, and then you're going to be setting your mix level to around 35%. Then we've got an EQ, which is bringing out some of that mid-range and cutting out the low end, and then we're using a compressor to control those dynamics, and again, it's brightening that top end. It's boosting the lows, but we've already cut the lows, so it shouldn't be doing anything there. And in context, it sounds a little bit like this. Next, we're going to be moving on to our drums. Now, if I go into the Groove Selective Warehouse Techno Volume 1 pack here, we're using kick 1, clap 3, closed hat 2, perk 19, and snare 5 from the pack. So if I go into kicks, just as an example, we've got a world of kicks here. We've got 17 different kicks. And then we've got some different clap sounds. Different closed hat sounds. If you want some drum loops. So in terms of breaking down the drums for this track, it's fairly straightforward. The kick's going to be landing on 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then our clap is going to be landing on the 2 and 4. Then we've got a closed hi-hat. And what you can do here is create a 16th note pattern and then just take out the last note of every bar. And then you're going to turn your velocity down on every second note that performs. And that sounds a little bit like this. And then we've also got a couple of perk hits that happen in the drop. And then you've got this little kind of snare fill, which is just playing 16th notes. And you can see how we've manipulated the velocities here to humanize it just a little bit. And if I load up my automation, we're using an EQ and we're cutting out all of that top end. And then you're going to go into your EQ. You're going to go high cut frequency and you're going to create a node at the start and a node at the end and a node in the middle. And your starting node is going to start at 970 Hertz. Your middle node is going to be at 458 Hertz. And then your ending node is also going to be at 970 Hertz. And in context, the drums sound a little bit like this. Finally, we've just got some effects. So I'm using downlifter free, the quick riser, and crash free from the pack. So again, if you load up our Groove Selective Warehouse Techno Volume 1 pack and you move into your effects, you can find the downlifter and the quick riser here. And then for your crash sound, you just go into cymbal and you can find a few crashes here too. And everything all together should sound a little bit like this. As always, thank you for tuning in to Groove Selective. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to check out all the sample packs down below. If you do like this video, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.